webinar on Willa Cather, My Antonia, one of her great novels. And this is part of the National Association of Scholars Great American Literature ongoing webinar series. And we're asking, what makes My Antonia a great American novel? How did Willa Cather's portrayal of the West and of working class people depart from that of other popular novels of the day? Who influenced Cather's writings and who did her writings influence? How would you describe her place in American literature? Now, I am delighted to have as our two speakers today, Professor John Schaff, who is a professor of government and director of the Center for Public History and Civic Engagement at Northern State University. And Dr. Schaff specializes in the study of American political thought and institutions and has published on the connection between politics and literature. Dr. Robert Thacker is Charles A. Dana Professor of Canadian Studies and English at St. Lawrence University. From 2006 to 12, he was its first Associate Dean for Academic Advising Programs, and he's a past president of the Western Literature Association Now, I'm not mentioning all of their books because they have just gone into the chat button down below. You can see a whole bunch of them. And I will add, for family pride, my uncle, John Herman Randall Jr., also wrote an early work on Willa Cather, which I'm putting a link into as well, The Landscape and the Looking Glass, Willa Cather's Search for Value. So this is by way of being old family webinar for me. I mentioned the chat button. We're going to be having 12 to 14 minute talks, happily conversational by Professor Schaff and Professor Thacker. We then have Q&A. That is, you, the audience, put in your questions into the chat or the Q&A button. I pass them on in whatever order it seems like it makes for a fun conversation. The professors are free to answer and look at the buttons themselves, to talk to each other. I feel like if I want to, I can ask questions. And this is how it will happen happily until about 3:30 or so. But please put in as many questions as you can. We love to hear from you. You're what make this a wonderful event, you, the audience. If you have to leave early, this is being recorded, National Association of Scholars YouTube channel. It'll be up within 24 hours usually for perpetuity. If any of your questions don't get answered, send them to me, Randall at nas.org. RANDALL at nas.org, and I will be glad to forward them to the professors. They can have the option to answer you. Having said all that, Professor Schaff, would you be so kind?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you for having me. I'm proud to be here with Robert, who we were discussing before we got on. I'm trusting Robert to get the literary side. I'm a mere political scientist, so he's got expertise I don't have, but what I wanted to start with is just simply talk my personal connection to Antonia and how I stumbled across it. I was in grad school at Loyola University in Chicago, and one of my professors, the late Tom Engelman, and some of my fellow students were extolling the virtues of Cather, who I'd never read at the time. And one day, those of you who've been to Chicago will be, I hope, intimately familiar with the University of Chicago Seminary Co-op bookstore on the South Side, which as grad students we frequented and spent what little money we had there. And I was down there, and there was a rack of Dover thrift classics. And on it was My Antonia by Willa Cather, and I brought a prop. It is this copy right here. I still have it. It is my working copy. This is it. And it's all beat up and written in. And so, I've heard a lot about Cather. I think I'm going to buy this. So I bought it for a grand total of $2, very nicely priced for your graduate student. And a few weeks later, I sat down on a Saturday morning and said, well, I've heard a lot about this. I guess I'll start reading this novel. And I was about 10 pages in, and I went, I know what I'm going to do today. I'm going to read this novel, and I read it in a day, which all of you who've read Antonia know that's not a huge feat because it's not a very big novel. But I sat down and I read it cover to cover in one day. And I started to teach. Even as a grad student, I taught the novel in a couple of classes. And when I interviewed for the job that I have right now, 21 years ago, a perplexed faculty member said, "Why is a political scientist teaching My Antonia novel?" And I must have given a good answer, because at least sufficient, because I got the job. And so I've taught it many times. I always teach it in my American political thought class. It's the last thing we do in American political thought is I teach My Antonia. So I've taught it many times. And so why is that? Why is My Antonia a great novel, and what can we in 2022 learn from a novel that was published 104 years ago, I guess? And so I'm not going to repeat plot. I don't think we're going to do that. But so let me speak thematically. And so I've written that I think that Antonia depicts what I call the tragedy of American progress. And by that, what I mean is, if you recall in Tocqueville, in the famous chapter on why Americans have a belief in the indefinite progress, and it's almost a religious belief. You notice that chapter comes in between, or amongst, a discussion of religion, and amongst it is this discussion of the American belief in infinite progress. And so it's almost like a religious fervor for Americans. Recall the discussion he has at the end of that chapter. He's talking to an American sailor, and he asks, "Why do American ships not last very long?" And the sailor says, well, in essence, I won't quote, but, well, we build for utility. The science of navigation and of shipbuilding is changing very quickly. We got to keep up with the times. And so, in essence, the science of navigation, or art of navigation, takes supremacy over beauty. And this, Tocqueville says, in fact, he says you can hardly overemphasize what this means to Americans. This idea that he thinks that the sailor thinks that we don't want to build useless ships, right? And so this desire for utility, for riches, for comfort, for efficiency, that could be solved by commerce and technology, I think sets up this tragic situation, that to achieve greater and greater material progress, maybe we have to destroy certain things that we hold dear. Maybe for progress, we need to leave place behind. Maybe we need to leave families behind, because being tied to a place and to a family makes you less economically productive. But what is the economic value of religion, of beautiful land, of community? And so a question I would pose, which I will admit I don't have a good answer to, is, just as an example, are we better off having Walmart, where we can buy our yogurt and underwear for dirt cheap, at the cost of eliminating locally owned business, right? And this is a tragedy. I think that for me, the attraction of Antonia is, I think it speaks to those questions. So let me just talk a little bit about why is that the case, and why do I think Antonia speaks to that. Let's start with the American fascination with money making. If you look at the novel, commerce is almost always, there's an exception to this, but it's almost always depicted in a negative light. In particular, two characters. One is Peter Krycek, who uses his knowledge of English to manipulate the immigrant Schmerdas to his own advantage. Then there's Willa Cather, who is described as the merciless Black Hawk moneylender, who has an evil name throughout the country. And even though Krycek's exploitation of the Schmerdas is, I think, depicted as the contributing to the eventual suicide of Mr. Schmerda. He's the story in the novel of the big fat snake who eats the prairie dogs, happens to be bookmarked or on either side by discussion of Krycek and of Willa Cather. And I think one of those powerful passages in the novel is the story of Peter and Pavel, the Russian immigrants, who, if you recall the story, when they're back in Russia, Peter and Pavel are driving a sleigh for a wedding. The wedding party is off through the woods on the snow, going to a wedding party, and they get descended on by wolves. And one by one, the wolves take down the sleighs until only Peter and Pavel, who are carrying the bride and groom, are the only ones left trying to stay ahead of the wolves. And they sort of encourage the groom, maybe shove the bride off. We could go faster. And being a good groom, he refuses. So Peter and Pavel literally throw the bride and groom to the wolves. And this is the beginning of Peter and Pavel's kind of history of bad luck, stems from this. So they end up in America and things go poorly for them. And that's literally bracketed. That's bracketed by tales of Willa Cather. And I think we're meant to read that story as this is what kind of self-interest in its worst aspects is like. Mr. Harling is the exception to commerce. We could talk about that maybe later, but I think commerce is largely depicted in a negative light in the novel. And of course, there's this connection to place, right? In this, I think, all-important summer before Jim leaves for college, right? He's reading Virgil, this author who created the myth of place for the Romans. He goes to this picnic with all the immigrant girls, and he gets nostalgic. He realizes, is this the last time I'm going to see these places? I'm going to be homesick for the river, the sandbars. And he starts to realize how much this place means to him. And he's reading Virgil, right, where he gets the epigraph to the novel, Optima Dies Prima Fugit, the best days are the first to flee. And Jim is inspired by Virgil, and he says, I am going to bring the muse to my own country. I'm going to write the story of my country. And Jim's guru, his professor, Gaston Cleric, tells Jim, by country, Virgil doesn't mean a nation like we would think of it today, but a small local community. And Jim, this is what Jim wants to do, but Jim, he doesn't do it. Ultimately, of course, he rejects the muse. He decides to become a lawyer for a major corporation. And for various reasons, I think the novel suggests that he has chosen poorly by doing that. Again, we get into why, but I'll just leave it at that for now. Well, what about family life? Cather suggests that family is integral to having a whole, happy, healthy life. And what I think might be my favorite passage of the novel, the immigrant girls in this summer where they're having this picnic, they're talking about what it was like growing up. And all these immigrant families were very big families. They were very poor, but they had lots of babies. And one of the immigrant girls, Anna, says, and I have this quote, yes, the babies came along pretty fast, to be sure, but I never minded. I was fond of them all. The youngest one that any of us want is the one we love best now. And I think the novel makes a subtle but unmistakable critique of Lena Lindegard, kind of Antonia's doppelganger, if you will, childless. Lena thinks that husbands and children are burdens that prevent you from leading an exciting and adventurous life. But Anna and the other immigrant girls recognize that they've sacrificed a lot for the prodigious number of children that their families have produced, but this has made them happier, right? And it's worth noting that Jim himself doesn't have any children. And at the end of the novel, when he comes back, it's, I think, made plain at the very beginning of the novel that Jim is married not entirely happily. He has no children. When at the end of the novel, 20 years later, he goes and he goes back to Black Hawk, and he meets Antonia for the first time in 2 decades. And she kind of critiques him. She thinks it's too bad he doesn't have any children. Whereas Antonia has now after 11, 12 children. Yet Jim he's left Nebraska. He does not become a muse to his country. He goes off to Harvard. He eventually becomes a lawyer. He's a corporate lawyer living in New York. Meanwhile, Antonia, she never leaves Black Hawk. She is first engaged with this ne'er-do-well named Larry Donovan, who steals money from the railroad he works for. He leaves a pregnant Antonia and runs off to Mexico. Antonia's own brother encouraged her to kill the baby, but she doesn't. In fact, she's described by one character as a natural-born mother. She eventually marries this farmer. She has 11 more children. And when Jim gets, as I say, when Jim comes back, he's embarrassed that Antonia, or that Jim has no children. Her husband is not a talented farmer, but he's very pleasant. He's hardworking. So she's not obsessed with material wealth. Her happiness, her wealth is in her children, her husband, the place she loves. And it's precisely giving herself over to family and place that brings her so much joy. And so Jim's admiration for her after all these years is a kind of self-indictment that he's chosen poorly in life, that with all his wealth and experience and education, he's less happy than Antonia. So I'll wrap up here because I think I'm right up against time. But so Cather suggests that progress, community, wealth versus family, technology or beauty, they can exist together. That there's a kind of this, as I say, this tragic situation that Americans love progress, but progress ends up eroding these things that we also value, like place, community, family, and that all we have left is to lament our precious, incommunicable past. So I will leave it at that, and I'm excited to hear what Robert has to say about Cather and this novel.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Professor Thacker.
Sure. Before we came online, John asked me if I had ever been to Red Cloud. And I said, well, yes, I just got back day before yesterday. Actually, I'm now the president of the Willa Cather Foundation. So one of the things we own is a whole lot of properties. And over COVID, we've been fixing those properties up. And so I went out to the Pavelka homestead, which we just fixed up. And that was where Annie Pavelka lived. Annie Pavelka was the prototype for Antonia. And the story that you described from the book is pretty much what her life was. And after we looked at the place, and you can go see it too if you're in that part of Nebraska, I crossed the road with a friend and we went and visited Annie's grave, okay, which is there. And she's right there with the husband, and all scattered all around are some of the 11 children that you just described, John. I actually, I don't think I've been to her grave before, so I was glad I went. The point there is that the story Cather tells is in a lot of ways a very autobiographical story. It's autobiographical in terms of some of the people she draws upon. There was a wick cutter, for example. There wasn't really a Jim Burden, because Jim Burden is Willa Cather. And I'll talk a little bit about that. This is an interesting challenge for me, because the whole notion of why do I think My Antonia is a great novel is one that I kind of enjoyed driving back and forth to Nebraska to think about, because although I was coming from the other direction because I'm in Colorado, there's a big difference between Eastern Colorado and Western Nebraska. And these days one place is much greener. In any case, some kind of basic stuff about Cather. Cather was born in 1873. She died in 1947. This book is, you've mentioned some of her earlier novels. Her first novel was a book called Alexander's Bridge, which mostly Cather people read. And she said some negative things about it in a famous essay. Later on, she has an essay called My First Novels. There were two. And the novel she prefers as her first novel is Oh Pioneers, which was published in 1913. I've been working on Cather since the 70s when I was doing my doctoral work. And one of the things that I was interested in prairie landscape, the depiction thereof. And one of the things that I remember thinking when I was a graduate student was, I thought it was odd that this author had decided to tell the story of prairie pioneering twice. So she does it in 1913, and then with My Antonia, she does it again in 1918. Well, why would she want to do that? seems to me that the reason she wants to do it, she wanted to do it and decided to do it, was because she changed the way the story was being told. In O Pioneers, and I'm sure many people have read that, what you get is pretty much a straight 1913 third-person novel. Okay, tells the story. Tells the story pretty well, and I think what she does there is really kind of tell readers not familiar with that part of the country how to read the landscape there. And if you go to and look at O Pioneers, you can see that she does that really from the first page, because the town of Hanover, Nebraska, is trying not to be blown away in a January snowstorm. And this is what I think's kind of the really interesting thing about the issue I pose here, and that is that after she finishes O Pioneer, she writes the Song of the Lark, which John mentioned. The Song of the Lark is essentially a Künstlerroman, that is the story of an artist's development. And Thea Kronberg goes from Moonstone, Colorado, which is really just a version of Red Cloud, Nebraska, to the operatic stages of Europe, becomes a diva. It's based partially on a Swedish opera singer named Olive Fremstad, and it's also based on a well-known now American writer named Willa Cather. That is, that she melded the two experiences, using her own emotions as a growing artist as the basis for that story. I recommend that story. It's a big long. It's one of her big long books, but it's an excellent book in many respects. Just as she was starting to work on that book, she got the opportunity to write S.S. McClures' autobiography. S.S. McClure was the founder of McClures Magazine, which is usually associated with muckraking, which the muckraking started about 1900. The first couple of decades of the century, it was kind of the equivalent of the New Yorker today. It was a monthly, but it had a circulation something in the order of 500,000. Cather worked at McClures from 1906 to the end of 1911. And she spent the last 3 years as managing editor of that magazine. McClure was in over his head financially pretty much the whole time she worked for him. And in 1912, just as she was trying to get away from the magazine in order to write, he got pushed out. And part of the deal in pushing him out was that he owed them a lot of money. And they said that if he wrote his autobiography, they would take the fee that he would normally get for that autobiography and put it against the monies that he owed. Now, this is a man who had so many ideas that he couldn't sit still, and there was no question that he wasn't going to sit down and write. All right, so what he did was he got Cather to write his autobiography. And you got to pause a second and say, Cather is writing his autobiography. What happened was that they were both in New York. He would come down to her apartment in the West Village and walk up and down while she sat and listened. She didn't take any notes. The story he told was basically the story he'd been telling on a lecture circuit. Right? Now, what's this have to do with my Antonia? Well, when his autobiography was published, first in McClures and then as a book in 1914, its title was My Autobiography. Okay. Well, those are the same initials as my Antonia, aren't they? So after she finishes the Song of the Lark, she takes that experience, and I'm not going to go into a lot of details unless people are interested, but she takes that experience of doing this work of, well, she was doing a favor for a friend. She admired McClure. He had done a lot for her. She was doing it really, I think, as much as anything out of gratitude. And this is what it seems to me is the important point here. And that is that he was telling her his story, but the difference was that he was telling her his story knowing that she was sympathetic to him, so that it was two people talking to one another who knew each other well. And that's what Cather recreates in My Antonia. If you think about the edition that you read, John, I think I'm right about this, probably has a 1926 introduction, a short one that's italicized mostly. Well, there was a longer one in 1918, which is in a lot of ways a better one. And actually scholars are now publishers are now running that one as the proper introduction, and they should, because what that introduction basically does is articulate the communion between the two people who are talking about Antonia on that train going across Iowa, right? And she was a shared presence in each of their lives. Right. And he says something at one point, that is, Burden writes something toward the end after when he shows up with that pink portfolio and puts a title on it, and, Antonia first, and then he adds the my. Well, that's really the point, because what he wants to do is he's not telling everything about Antonia. He's telling what he remembers about her, because as he says in there, he says, it's through myself that I knew and felt her. And so what we're really getting in the story is, as I say, I mean, the word I used was communion, is the relationship between Burden and this unnamed narrator. Okay, and it's clear in the introduction that the unnamed narrator is a writer, because he says, I don't understand why you never said anything about wrote anything about Antonia. So that person is likely as not Cather herself. Okay, and so the thing is, by setting this up so carefully and telling this tale the way he does, she creates an intimacy in the story which is much deeper than you normally see in a novel. In fact, there was a review in the New York Sun when the book was published that really pleased Cather. In fact, it pleased her so much that she transcribed it and sent it to relatives back in Nebraska. And it was something to the effect that you pick up My Antonia. It's a novel. I hope it's a good one. And you find yourself positively enthralled instead by autobiography, right? And so that's the way the story is being told. So that when Jim is talking about the various people whom John has mentioned, he's really talking about them as people who he knew and he knew of and he knew the reputation of. We talked about Willa Cather. Of course, Willa Cather does something fairly vile to Jim, and Jim takes it pretty hard. Jim is actually, I think he's something of a prig. And the thing is, too, is that Jim is, just as John said, somebody who probably hasn't had a very happy life. Cather has another character, this one's in the Song of the Lark, who is rather like Jim, and he has a bad marriage, and in fact, his wife is killed by she's so focused on cleaning that she gets these cleaning fluids that she shouldn't use and blows up the house. Okay, well, nothing so dramatic happens to Jim's wife, but the narrator in the introduction says it very clearly. Also, I don't like his wife. And so, you know, I mean, that's as I say, it's this intimate story. Okay, how am I doing? Other things. It seems to me that when we try to think about this book as a great American novel, one of the things that I think you have to take into account and think about is the way in which she's telling a central American story. That is the story of pioneering, okay, which involves Euro-Americans heading west after the Civil War, primarily, pushing Native peoples out of the way. There's no question about that either. And although that's not a story Cather wants to tell much, right? I mean, there are mentions of Native Americans here, the circles and so forth. But you know, her focus is elsewhere. But what she does do in the book, I think, which is compatible with that idea, is essentially to kind of tell the story of what's usually called the American melting pot. That is the immigration coming from Europe. So that we, you know, if you think about the people we've got in this book, I mean, we've got all the different immigrants, the Bohemians, the Norwegians, the Swedes, the Australians, the Russians, Peter and Pavel, whom you mentioned. There's that fellow who throws himself into a threshing machine. And he says, I thought this was America. Okay, or America, I guess he says. Right, well, it's not unlike things we've been hearing lately, is it? You know, so that it's been there for a while. But Cather was all about, and you mentioned this too, with the mention of Virgil's Georgics that Clark talks about. Cather was very intent on bringing European culture into the ken of this country. You know, I will be the first, if I live, to bring the muse into my country. I mean, that's what she's trying to do herself. A word about the Cathers themselves. There's an area north of Red Cloud, which is, the township is still called Catherton, okay? And it's called Catherton because the Cathers left Northern Virginia, right up by the West Virginia border, after the Civil War. Now, the Civil War was a divisive thing, as we all know. And one of the things that it divided were you know, neighbors from neighbors. The Cathers were sheep farmers, and Charles Cather had his barn burned down. This was in the late 70s, early 80s. And it was pretty clear that that was a message, that the house would be next, because the Cathers, by and large, were Union sympathizers. They weren't slave, you know, nobody was, well, there were slave owners in the family. But they left to go to Nebraska, in part because of the discord caused by the Civil War. And the area in which they lived during the Civil War was changed hands something like 70 times. So the thing is that there's that, okay? So what she's giving us is she's giving us this, you know, this picture of the Westward movement. As I said earlier, one of the things too that she does is look at the West in a way that doesn't really take up or pay much attention to the Western myth, the cowboys and Indians and all that. This is I say, the West as living space. One more point, and then I think I'm done. One of the questions we were posed was, you know, how is she seen? Well, I think that she was in a lot of ways a classic, that is in the sense of classics, also Western European history education. That's what she got at home at the University of Nebraska. She wrote like that for a long time, and I would point out that her first novel was published in 1912, which means she was born in 1873, so she's in her late 30s. She does an about face with O Pioneers in the various writings that I'm talking about. That is the bringing the muse into the country. The other point, and I'll stop with this, is that she was the leading novelist of the 1920s. She was old enough to be the mother of Faulkner, Hemingway, Fitzgerald. Those were all writers who read her very carefully. And indeed, I'm of the view that Fitzgerald could not have written The Great Gatsby, probably thought of as a great American novel, without Cather having written A Lost Lady, 1923. And indeed, there are real questions about how Fitzgerald read it and what he took from it. And he wrote a letter to Cather where he refers to a case of apparent plagiarism in the characterization of Daisy Buchanan and Marian Forrester. So, I mean, I think that the Cather we have now, who is, I think, in the ascendant in a lot of ways, was for a long time minimized because these other folks came forward. And I do think that that's changing. Okay. I think I'll stop there and go to the Q&A if that's okay.
Thank you so much. So, yeah, wonderful hearing you. And I will indeed encourage various people to put in your questions so we can have a good multivocal conversation. The first question is from Kevin Pete. What do you think of her success in writing in a man's voice?
Is that for me? Yeah,
either of you. I mean both in turn.
I believe it. One of the things I've always thought is the particularly in the first book, in the Schmerdes, that comes through, right? And perhaps I should have said that the experience that Jim Burden has when he makes the comment about he had this is so much land that it's that a country is made of. The thing is that was Cather's own experience. That is, when the Cathers came out, that is, the Charles Cathers came out, because Charles' brother and there were other Cathers who had come out before them. And that's why the area is called Catherton. But the thing is that Cather, Willa Cather, was the oldest child. She was 9 years old when they came out in March of 1883. And so the experience that she gives to Jim Burden of, the train arriving at the station. Okay. I was just in the station the other day because the foundation owns that. And that whole experience of being picked up in a wagon and going out north of town in the dark was Willa Cather's experience. I think kind of in the middle of the book, you forget about Jim for a while and go with the characters and the episodes, right? Because her structure really is one of, if not exactly vignettes, then certainly a succession of images of people doing various things as the narrative proceeds, right? And she was an experimenter. I mean, you see that also in The Professor's House, and you see that in Death Comes to the Archbishop too, I think.
And then Professor Schaff, do you want to add to that?
I say this. I wonder if Robert has anything to say to this. That part that maybe the success of Jim's voice, if we want to talk about her writing in a man's voice, is that Jim himself is, despite he is married but childless. He's a kind of, in a way, a kind of androgynous character.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And his relationship with Antonia, despite the fact when he's leaving for the first, when he leaves before he comes back and he says whatever the line is, like I would have liked to have you been to me anything a woman could be to a man, or something like that. But their relationship is more like siblings than it is. It's not a romantic relationship, even though obviously there are other characters, because if there is a romance that Jim has, it's with Lena Lindegard. Even then, it's sort of at a distance. He kind of worships her from afar. But if it's my Antonia, and if Antonia is a central character, the relationship between Jim and Antonia is not romantic or sexual, because all the sexual tension is with Lena, and maybe that's a different subject. But that probably helps in allowing Cather to give voice, a credible voice to Jim.
Yeah, I think that that's true, and I think the androgynous is true. Now there is that scene where he's walking her home, and he kisses her, and she gets mad and says, "You have no business kissing me like that." Yeah. Well, since I don't know who's watching me, I'm not going to say what I would say in one of my old classrooms. But the thing is, it's pretty clear that the kind of kiss he gave her was not a sibling kiss. And so her reaction, and of course she is, the rich mind of life. She is what Willa Cather lusts after. Okay. So that she is, on her own part, very attractive and sexually attractive. So too is Lena Lindegard, and frankly, I think they do have a relationship, and I think that, and it may be a sexual relationship, and I think the comments of the other people in Lincoln, I mean, that what's the guy? He's a Polish fellow. He doesn't like him. And Cleric makes some comment about your handsome Swede, right? And of course, she gets in, when she's still in Blackhawk, I mean, she's causing trouble with, other people in the neighborhood because of her attractiveness. So see, and that's, I mean, part of that is how the book, and of course, this is at a time where you got the Comstock laws and people are banning books, right? And so the thing is that there's a fair amount of Subrosa sexuality in the book, which is there and you can point to. Okay, I mean, he never has that dream about Antonia, and it's a weird dream. I mean, castration. I mean, in a variety of ways of looking at that. So she's got a lot of different things. I mean, it's a far more sophisticated book than it appears on at first blush, which I think is part of its charm. The book's never been out of print except for a short period when there was a printer's strike, so far as I know. So, and that was what Cather was aiming at. She wanted people to read her, and not have her assigned to them. So,
let me just say one more thing to this question, because when Robert was talking, one of my favorite scenes in the novel that I think sort of typifies the relationship that Jim has with these two different girls/women is I think it's on the day of the picnic, and they've been swimming, and Jim has sand in his hair, and Lena's going to get the sand out of his hair, and she's just sort of running her fingers through his hair. And Antonia goes, "Oh, you'll never get it out that way." And she musses up his head and slaps him upside the head. And so the relationship there, I mean, Lena tries to get sand out of his hair like she's a lover, and Antonia does it like she's a mother, because she's going to get it done. And in a lot of that kind of tip of there's this relationship with Antonia. I'd forgotten the kiss scene, so I'm glad you reminded me of that. But to me, it's always been kind of familial, whereas the tension with Lena, with Lena and I think everything that walks on God's green earth, there's some sexual tension between Lena and everything else. It's palpable. She and her undulating walk, I think, is how it's described.
And that whole picnic scene is a central scene, because that's the sun setting behind the plow. Scene, which is kind of the mythic pioneering scene, but it's also in there too that they tell the story of Coronado and Mr. Schmerda is evoked as well, his reasons for his suicide, and you know, Annie Pavelka's father did commit suicide in much the same way.
I'm going to do a follow-up question on voice, which is presumably, you know, a great deal of what she's famous for is, you know, the Midwestern voice, the immigrant voice. So I'm going to ask, one, how successful is she at that? And then two, how much is this a unique success of hers? And then three, just related to this, what's she doing that Hamlin Garland, say, doesn't? She's not the first person to mine this, you know, area of the United States for literary content, but presumably she does it somewhat better than a good deal of her competitors, which is why she's remembered. So what does she do that Hamlin Garland doesn't?
Want me to do that? Hamlin Garland.
Oh, okay, I read Mean Traveled Road.
Careful.
No, I know.
South Dakota connections here.
He's actually got a book that nobody reads that I liked a lot called The Moccasin Ranch that gets into some of the same stuff, the same pioneering stuff. The thing is, I think what she does, and this really happens from the beginning of the narrative proper, is you know, because, you know, they arrive and, you know, we go Black Hawk, Nebraska. Okay, Antonia says, and that's the sum total of her English at the beginning. And so then we watch her develop in her use of English and in her sophistication. In the snake scene that John mentioned, okay, which is, you know, the same kind of thing as we were talking about sexuality. You know, we're in Eden and look at this Eden, and here's this great big snake. And, you know, if he was in fighting form, you know, Jim wouldn't have been able to handle him, but he was kind of a retired snake. Right. And so the thing is that, you know, she sets that stuff up, but then Jim turns to her, and this is the priggishness that I'm talking about. See, because the other thing too is that there's a difference between all the immigrants and you know, who allow their daughters to work out, and the so-called native-born Americans, of whom Jim is one. So Jim, it's useful to keep in mind that he's younger than she is. But you know, I mean, his reaction after the snake scene is, you know, why did you jabber bohunk? Okay, he says, right? Well, and of course, things like that were said. Things like that, you know, we wouldn't say them today, but that's what they would have been said then. Okay, I answering your question flat out, David, is it seems to me that what she does is she creates immigrant characters with, you know, European backgrounds and linguistic backgrounds who are believable and interesting in the way, and that's why I've read my Hamlin Garland, but I'm not very enthusiastic about it. Okay, whereas, you know, Cather really gets it, and Cather really does it. When I talked about O Pioneers, I said she taught Eastern readers to understand the Great Plains landscape, you know, the whole all day long Nebraska business that's in the introduction. And that's true, and we still do that. I mean, people, you know, I told somebody I was driving to Nebraska. It's about 400 miles, and somebody said, "Oh, what will you do?" And I said, "Oh, I don't think it's boring at all. I know what to look for." And I think that's you know, that's part of the American experience, is learning how to. That's what I mean by the West as living space, that I think she's able to get at in her Western works. And of course, this is a novelist who is known for this, or her Western works. But if you go through the progression of her novels, one of the things you notice is she never does the same thing twice, except for the O Pioneers to My Antonia.
I would say one thing I can say about Cather, I should probably be able to speak more intelligently about Hamlin Garland. There's a highway named after him about 30 miles to north. That way, I'm pointing north. 30 miles to north of me, there's Hamlin Garland Highway, but I don't know enough of Garland to speak about him intelligently. So I'll just speak about Cather, and hopefully it's intelligent. It's one of the things I think she does successfully. As Robert was talking, I was thinking of Sinclair Lewis or F. Scott Fitzgerald, who are certainly from the Midwest. I don't know how much you would call them Midwestern novelists, probably Lewis more so than, it's Lewis more so than Fitzgerald. Is unlike Lewis, Ántonia has an affection for these people where Lewis didn't necessarily. Right. Gopher Prairie and the various iterations of Red Cloud and Cather are very different because Cather always writes with affection for whatever in this case Black Hawk, however she disguises Red Cloud. It's usually with affection, and I think whether it's the Prairie, or even thinking of Death Comes from the Archbishop, is Cather seems to have this ability to turn geography into a character. Yeah. And to compare her to someone who, of course, is a very different novelist, one of the things that makes Tolkien an effective writer, when Tolkien can go on for pages and pages where nothing's happening, he's simply describing landscape. And it's interesting because he's so good, even when the landscape is not literally alive, which sometimes it is, he can make it into a character. And I think what Cather is very good, whether it's the Prairie or the Desert Southwest or now you have to get my 17th century Quebec. Right. She's very good at turning that place into a character, and it's not merely, like reading a geography textbook of here's what this place looks like. Is she can give it real character, and that's, I think, what makes her. If we're just simply talking about the Midwest and the Plains, I think that's what makes her more effective maybe than some novelists. Is she both cares and is effective in turning that place into a character which people have an affection for. I see someone in chat is talking about Tony Hillerman. I've not read Hillerman, but it's New Mexico, right? If I understand. And so something like that. That's one of the things that makes a good regional novelist something more than just a regional novelist. Is you can encourage or convince people who aren't from that place and maybe have no particular attachment to that place has meaning and is something that's worth caring about. And I think a good novelist of place is able to do that.
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. And I mean, that's what I was referring to at the beginning of Pioneers. I mean, one of the things I used to do when I taught Shadows on the Rock, which I did fairly often because I was teaching Canadian things, is to just would give the students the first, even if they weren't reading the book, I'd give them the first 2 pages, which essentially is the description of what the city of Quebec was like in what year is it? It's about 1670. Okay, and if you could take it now and go to Quebec, and it would still fit precisely, right? And the island of Orleans, what the river looked like, what you could see from the precipice and all that, where the Chateau Frontenac is. No, I mean, I think that's absolutely right, John. And I think that's the other thing too, is I'd say that she writes about these places and these people with both affection and also respect. Okay, which I think is an issue with Lewis.
Yeah, I was going to add when it's been 20 years since I've been in Red Cloud, and when I went to Annie Pavelka's house, which I'm interested where I don't remember the gravesite being there. I probably just didn't know, or it wasn't marked.
It's not there. It's across the road. There's a cemetery.
Oh, on the other side of the road. Oh, I drove right by it, didn't know it was there. But anyway, I remember I went behind the house because one of the things I wanted to do is that she's so evocative of the country. And as I want to get behind the house, I just want to look at the countryside, and I want to see what Cather is seeing. I have a couple photographs I took. I wanted, and this was in summer. It was in August, I think, but everything was green at the time, and I have photographs of that because she had made me. I'm a Midwesterner, so it wasn't that hard to turn me on to it, but it's what I grew up with. But I want to see this space that she wrote about so apart. It's almost like I want to meet this character. Like if you could meet Antonia, wouldn't it be great to meet Antonia? Well, I could meet one of the characters in the novel. It was the landscape of southern Nebraska.
Yeah, and it's still there, as I say. I just saw it. Yep. The other thing too is that there's that fruit cellar, which in the last book, all the kids pop out of, and that no, that's still there, and it's there. And you can go down in it. Yep. I pass because the steps are kind of steep.
So I have a question which I'm going to build on from Daniel. Which authors did Cather read and who influenced her? And I'm going to ask about her influence in particular, actually, on the Midwestern tradition. As you've mentioned, General, Fitzgerald is reading her. What about the Midwestern novel? Does Marilyn Robinson and Gilead owe anything in particular to Cather, and so on? So I guess Daniel's question first, and mine follow up.
Well, because and here again, this is a factual matter. She publishes O Pioneers in 1913. This one is 1918. And I think that, and yes, you're right about Hamlin Garland and James Fenimore Cooper, and there are a couple of other writers you could point at who were doing the region before her, but not very many. And certainly not as strongly as we have said. As it happens, I did a lot of work on Canadian writing of the prairies in my dissertation and then in a book. And the thing is that most of that was happening in the 20s, or later, right? And so the thing is that anybody, Canadian or no, who wanted to write about the prairie had to read Cather. So I think that, if you look at, oh shoot, I'm going to blank out on the page. Smiley, her book on Iowa, the Lear thing. You can't describe that landscape without reference to Cather, because, in a lot of ways she got there first, and she got there first as a place that people were making their own. The other day I went into a house that her uncle built, George Cather, and they started when they got out there before Charles Cather. Well, they started in a dugout, as so many people. That is, a sod house, digging into the land, making a roof with sod. This house that I was visiting, we went down in the basement, and you couldn't really see any dirt, but you could see that they had just built up from the sod as they added on to the house, so that it's adaptation to the land. So, my general reaction to that is that anybody who writes out of that region has to contend with Cather in fairly significant ways. Wallace Stegner, who's somebody that I know something about, referred to Cather reasonably frequently. And I know certainly that he knew her. In his book Wolf Willow, he talks a good deal about her at one point.
Professor Schaff, did you want
Robinson
to
Davies?
The great Canadian novelist. I don't know.
All I can add to that is, because Robert's our actual literary expert about influences and influence of Cather. So I'd be interested. I don't know if Robert can answer who is Cather reading and where does she fit? Because as you were intimating when you were talking, is that Cather is sort of on this leading edge of I'll call it a renaissance. Maybe that's the wrong word, but it's burgeoning of American literature. When you mentioned Faulkner and Hemingway then you get Lewis and Fitzgerald,
Mm-hmm.
and all these people are going to explode about 10, 15 years after Cather's, at least her early novels are coming out. But no, that's like, well, so who's before that Catherine might have been building up. But what I was going to say about this influence thing, I mean, two novels. I'm a native Minnesotan. I went to St. John's University, home of two wonderful writers, John Hassler and J.F. Powers. And I think what you can see, I don't know how much they were reading Cather, but I think we're just going back to our previous discussion. One of the things that I enjoy about them as novelists, especially as Midwestern novelists, if I don't want to pigeonhole them, but there's certainly something to it, is that sense of place. Especially, I'm thinking of Powers' first novel, the Mort d'Urban novel, which is isolated, the sense of isolation as the main character moves from Chicago to rural Minnesota, and that sense of isolation. I think Hassler, who's he gets winter, that's for sure. He certainly gets winter, very much so. If you read his novels, you know what a Minnesota, and in my case Dakota winter is like. And I think that's probably their ability to write about place has got to be influenced by the way Cather could bring the Midwest to life. I'd be interested if Robert could talk about what Cather read and what influences were on her, because I don't think I can answer that question.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of alluded to it. I mean, she was an omnivorous reader, okay, and she wrote, and she had from a young age, she had a thirst for embracing the whole of the Western canon. I mean, she basically did a degree at Nebraska in classics. But at the same time, she was doing language, and she was doing English, and she was doing linguistics. When we talk about specific influences, you mentioned Tolstoy in passing. Certainly, she read her Tolstoy. She knew the Russians very well. The Russian writer, though, who comes up, I think, most frequently in discussions of hers is Turgenev. Particularly his some of his short stuff. And Madame Bovary is Flaubert is another. So French writing too. And so the thing is, that's why I said she does an about face. I mean, because she studies all this, and then when she goes to write it herself, she really is taking her own place and her own stories, and using some of the same techniques that she's found in European antecedents. She knew American writing too. One of the things I've been doing for about the last 10 years, and I think I'm getting toward the end of it, I hope anyway, is that I've been looking at her poetry. I mean, most people don't know that her first book was a book of poems published in 1903 called April Twilights. Right. And so she was also availing herself to all of that. She was a very early and a very enthusiastic reader. And she wrote had a couple of letters back and forth with Robert Frost in the teens when he was emerging. So, I mean, I think that she didn't miss much. Another thing she did that was interesting is, and one thing we haven't even said anything about, and it's probably I've been remiss, is that when My Antonia was published in 1918, she insisted on the Benda woodcuts. Okay, that is the picture, and they're not in every edition now. But she wanted this thing to be a book that appeared not as a child's book, but a kind of a warm, inviting thing with images. And so there are those in there. And in fact, you can argue that she left Houghton Mifflin because she didn't think that they handled the woodcuts particularly well. she goes to a young guy by the name of Alfred A. Knopf and his wife Blanche. And the Knopfs, you can make a perfectly reasonable argument that Cather made the Knopfs and the Knopfs made Cather because they had been publishing stuff that was in public domain and that they brought over from Europe. And she was one of their early and ultimately most productive writers when they were doing it. So I don't know if that answers the question. There's very little that, not that, but I mean, funny things like in her letters. The complete letters are online from the University of Nebraska, but the selected letters that were published in 2013 are worth reading, because the thing is that this is a person who not much got by her. I mean, she was even paying attention to, who was hanging around Paris in the 20s when Hemingway and James Joyce and others were there. So I mean, putting my cards on the table, I mean, I think she was a genius, and she was a genius in lots of different ways.
Thank you. I'm going to have a question on the whole great American novel thing again. How much is the shift towards the great American novel being urban rather than rural, the anxiety of influence? How much is there a sense that Cather has done so much for rural America that if we're going to do the great American novel in the future, we better go to the city because she's already done the countryside?
Well, there are a lot of people. In fact, I talked to somebody about doing this when I was in Red Cloud, and she said, well, I don't believe in the great American novel, right? And I think her argument would be that that every novel rises or falls on its own attributes, and that there is no quintessential. I mean, I think you can make an argument for pioneering as an archetypal story, but there are other things that might be written of as well. And there's not a lot of urban in Cather, but there is some. I mean, after all, we're talking about somebody who moved to New York in 1906 and died there in 1947. And while she traveled a good deal, I mean, she basically was a New Yorker.
Now, I'm wondering what these, I mean, I have some ideas about what these great urban novels are. Are there something you're thinking about, David, or particular authors that you're thinking about?
Actually, I mean, I'm about to say the great American urban novel is something I have been trying to think, what are the great exemplars? Saul Bellow is what it comes to mind.
Well, yeah, that's the first thing that came to mind was Bellow.
I'm an American born, in Chicago, whatever the first line of Augie.
Nah, he was born in Canada.
Yeah, but this is what makes him American.
Because even, because as I guess to me that if someone's going to ask me what the great American novel was, and I don't know that it's sort of like when they're sitting around the bar talking about who the best football team is, but which is fun, which is why we do it. And maybe why we even have this series with NAS. It's just fun to talk about it, because I would nominate Huckleberry Finn by great meaning quintessential, also being high quality. And that's, there's a lot going on in Huckleberry Finn, but one of the things that's going on there it's an adventure story. And it's a story that, in that case, on a river, but there's something about the wilds. And I think that Americans are drawn to that kind of story. And even thinking about, I was even thinking about a little bit of Bellow, and I'm just kind of going through some novels in my head, is that even those, I haven't read everything that's Saul. In fact, I haven't read a ton of Bellow, but it seems like they're all kind of quest novels. They're quest, though. It's a quest, though it's more of an individual quest in many cases. With Bellow, is that there's something about this. What does Tocqueville say? There's a disquietude in the American soul, and that comes out in every American novel, perhaps, or the great American novels. There's a kind of disquietude. At least it's one of the things I'd look for in something that's a very quintessentially American novel is this, and that's why pioneering is a common theme in American novels is this idea of adventure and getting to the next place, and even as you reach to the mid 20th century, as the frontier has long since been closed by that point, is not just Americans, but Americans become interested in a different kind of adventure. The science fiction adventure is a different kind of pioneering, and so you've got I don't know how many of them are great novels, but there's some very good science fiction novels. I think Bradbury is at least near great, if not great himself. It happens to be my favorite science fiction novelist is Bradbury. And those are, and so I think that's what really sets it apart. And what Cather and other novelists are doing is it's more overt in that it's a literal pioneer novel, and this idea of traveling and going to a new place is part of what at least a lot of what of American fiction is about.
Thank you. I'm going to go to a question again from the audience. Pam Walter, what about her characters like the lawyer and the boy in Paul's case, who reversed the Western movement and moved east as she did herself? And I guess just pushing on that, I think you were saying something about this earlier, but in fact, is she, the novelist, not just the novelist of the Midwest, but the novelist of, the Midwesterner who has moved east, she is the novelist of the urban memory of the rural past, the novel of the complexities of the American experience, even within this basic pioneering myth.
Well, I do think one of the things you see, at least in a lot of Cather's novels, I'm kind of just running them down in my head as I think about this, and I'd be really interested in Robert's take on this. There seems to be in Cather's novel a generational theme, and I think you see this most overtly, really well in Antonia, and I think I'm thinking of A Lost Lady is where I see it very overtly, that there's this difference between first generation pioneers and then second and third generation. There's this idea that as you get to subsequent generations, there's a kind of corruption. Right. That pioneering spirit is gone, and there's something to the second and third generation that they see the West, broadly speaking, the Midwest, the West, as merely money-making opportunities. And I think A Lost Lady is a good example of that. And I wonder if that's something about what's going on about this sort of inability to pass on that pioneering spirit and the love of the land that in various. I mean, this happens to Jim Burden himself, though feels guilty about it. I think the evidence of the novel of Antonia is that's the case. Is that this desire to escape or maybe not quite see some characters, this love of place. Well, I guess you see that in Song of the Lark too, right? Now I'm trying to remember. It's been too long since I've read it. Is it Thea? Is that the main character? Thea? Yeah. Is her name right? She does come back at one point to Moonstone briefly. I can't remember, but essentially she leaves.
No, but it's mostly in her imagination. I mean,
yeah, okay, I can't remember. Yep.
Yeah, her mother dies, and she's got a performance in Europe, and so doesn't go back. So
I'm sorry. I just think there's this tension that she has of what do we make of the West, and what do we make of this desire to leave it? And part of it, I think, is do you have this most in that introduction, that anonymous introduction to Antonia, Jim Burden is described as a romantic, right? And that's his view. He has this romantic, almost nostalgic view of Nebraska, of Black Hawk, that he forsakes because he's got other priorities. I think as you see some characters leaving the Midwest and pursuing other things, that it's an indication of I think she sees that the love of the land that first generation pioneers have. There is a difficulty in passing that down to subsequent generations, and guys, maybe this is part of her indictment of the inquisitive character of Americans, is that they can't take care of this thing, and in some cases characters simply leave rather than be stewards of what they've been given.
Oh no, I think it's so. One of the things she did, and it's well known, but I'm not sure how many people read it. She wrote an essay and published it in 1923 called "Nebraska: The End of the First Cycle." Okay, and it's basically an essay of the kind of analysis that you've just offered, the differences between the generations, and all the rest. And that that tension is there. It's in O Pioneers. To some degree, it's available in this book too, and it's certainly in A Lost Lady, as you say. So I think that's something that she is well aware of. I tend to stay away from the notion of nostalgia with Burden, because it seems to me that by creating the story the way she does, it's basically his own reminiscences and his own values and his own life. And I think you're absolutely right. It's sad. But she makes him a lawyer for the railroads, and ipso facto, the railroads are certainly not going to do much for rural America, right? And we've all read The Octopus, so I think that she's well aware from that. The other thing about Cather is that she finishes A Lost Lady, all right, and then she basically shifts. Now the Professor's House has the discovery of Mesa Verde in it and gets into other kinds of things, but she effectively leaves Nebraska and doesn't really come back until the stories in Obscure Destinies, Neighbor Rosihi, Old Mrs. Harris, and Two Friends. And the Nebraska there is a different Nebraska than the one of the team. Same thing's true of Lucy Gayheart, 1935. And so I think, this is a writer going on. I mean, growing older and perhaps wiser, right? She used somebody wrote her about Sapphira and the Slave Girl after she published it in 1940. And she used a line that actually I've used a lot in different contexts, where she says, it's the place I started out from. She was talking about Virginia, but she had two places where she started out from, and Nebraska's the other one. And she never really loses that. But she herself, I mean, after her parents died, her mother died in the early 30s, she came back to write Cloud, had a big party, fixed up the house, and then went back to New York and never came back. She's buried in New Hampshire. So I think that and that's something people in Nebraska always notice. I think that the back and forth between the two with somebody like this is a pretty complex thing.
Yeah. Please to say, I see we've got other questions, but I just want to say something about nostalgia. Some people might be familiar with, there's at North Dakota State, the psychologist Clay Routledge, who's written a lot on nostalgia. And if you take Clay's sort of theory of nostalgia, is being psychologically necessary, that when we feel anxious in our lives and we encounter a lot of stress, that nostalgia is very psychologically healthy, because it's a going home. And we need at various times in our life to go back home, right, to find some grounding. And so I use, nostalgia is one of those words, kind of like pride. It's a double-edged sword. Do you mean it negatively or positively? But I think what Clay has done in his work is sort of reinterpret nostalgia, which we normally, when we use the word, we think of someone as being merely nostalgic, a longing for something that's been past or maybe was never there. And I think what he's saying, and it's why I think it's a good lens to look at a lot of Katherine and Ántonia in particular, is when someone is homeless looking for a home, and nostalgia is trying to return back home, and periodically we all need to do that to remain psychologically healthy. And I know we've got this other question, but when you were talking, Robert, about this change of tone, so to speak, from earlier novels to later novels, I was wondering if you had any opinion about there's a gap, because Cather was relatively prolific in writing novels, but there is, correct me if I'm wrong, a 4-year gap between Ántonia and one of ours.
One of ours.
All right.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I guess you're more the literary expert. I'm sure she was writing other things, but it's noticeable. I think that's the biggest gap between novels in her career. It's got to be close. But what my point is, I wonder how much the First World War influenced her view, because I pick up that there's, in general, because I can think of exceptions, in general, the three Nebraska novel, or the Midwest novel, I'm talking Pioneers, Song of the Lark, Ántonia, are very, I would say, just positive novels, right? The ethos of them is one of celebrating the Midwest, of Nebraska, they're very positive, and there is a kind of so very optimistic. I guess that's the word I'm looking for. There's an optimism in there, and there's a kind of creeping. I don't want to. Pessimism is the wrong word, but more realistic, or maybe just less optimistic view in ensuing novels. And I think there are exceptions to that, especially the two I'll call them the Catholic novels might be exceptions to that. But I mean, one of ours, Lucy Gayheart, is an obvious example of that. That it's almost and Lost Lady, they're almost depressing reads in some sense. So do you think the First World War had anything to do with that, or do you think that's just a happenstance in the chronology?
Oh no, I think it did. The gap between my Ántonia and one of ours, actually, she published a book in 1920, Youth in the Bright Medusa, which is short stories. And it's got 4 short stories from her 1905 first collection of fiction, The Troll Garden, revised, and then 4 new short stories. And actually, talking about that urban point, I mean, if you look at the what I think is one of her finest stories, Coming Aphrodite, is one of the new stories in there, and it's very much a New York City story. One of ours is an interesting book because it's based, as I said at the top, it's a very autobiographical writer. And she basically, and of course, this is the book for which she gets the Pulitzer Prize in 1923 for 1922, which was still a kind of a new prize. And so it might not be the same thing it is now, although that's what we were talking about in Red Cloud. So I'm not entirely sure on that stuff. But anyway, she had a cousin named G.P. Cather, who was really kind of a ne'er-do-well, and had tried various things and had never really caught on until the war came along. And he went into the Army, and by all accounts was a pretty successful, he was a lieutenant at infantry level, and he was killed in May of 1918. Well, she based that novel, not completely, but in part, on his experience. And in some ways that was different than she had always had ever done. She had difficulty writing it, okay? Whereas a novel like A Lost Lady, which was based on somebody she remembered from her girlhood, and which was kind of initiated by her reading of the prototype's obituary, and it just came to her. It's a shorter novel, obviously, but one of ours was it was like the war was too close. Okay, but I think you're absolutely right that when you look at a book like that, it is more realistic or naturalistic. Okay, because of the nature of the war, and there were different. She got some fairly bad reviews on that, where and most of it was sexist. That a woman hadn't any business writing war scenes, and I don't think the war scenes are that bad. Hemingway famously deprecated her but it was in a private letter, so she didn't know that. But Hemingway deprecated everybody. So I think, but I think your point. And the other thing is that's actually kind of because at that point she's written several books, and she's moving on to other things. And the three novels that come after A Lost Lady, The Professor's House, which I think is probably her most densely philosophical book, My Mortal Enemy, which is, it's not slight, but it's kind of depressing. And then Death Comes to the Archbishop, very different from what we have been talking about today.
Thank you. And by the way, it's now 3:27, so I think I'm going to say this is the time which I say I would love to have a last minute or so of concluding talks, comments by the two of you, and then I'll just wrap this up as a whole. So I'll reverse order. Professor Thacker, would you care to give a minute first?
Yeah, sure. This has been fun. I noticed that in the chat that somebody asked about her style. I think one of the things that characterizes her style, she was a very hard worker. She was what I would call an organic writer. That is that she drafted and drafted and drafted. And her life partner, Edith Lewis, a very good book came out a couple of years ago by Melissa Homestead on the creative collaboration between Cather and Lewis. And Lewis was a professional editor. And so she did a lot to help Cather. Cather wrote the books, but Lewis, did. There's evidence of real editing. It's clear prose, okay, and it's moving prose. But as I say, she also experimented because of course, with The Professor's House, she plunks she's got two sections that are third person, and then she plunks a first person account in the middle of it. And the idea that we've talked about, and I'm just about finished, the idea we talked about, my Antonia or my autobiography. Well, in The Professor's House, the question is my Tom Outland. All these people have different versions of who Tom Outland is and how he should be seen. And the fact that he's dead means that they can argue the way they will. And of course, that's partly what Cather was doing. I'm finished.
Professor Schaff.
Yeah. Well, let me just say this in conclusion, although I suspect with whoever is watching or will watch this, I'm preaching to the choir. You're probably participating in this because you're a Cather fan. But I think the sell on Cather, and this is sort of Billy, I was thinking about this, describe Cather's writing style and maybe contrasting her with other American novelists is, I was thinking of something like Fitzgerald, who's kind of psychological, especially I'm thinking The Tender is the Night, which is almost oppressively psychological. Yeah. Though also autobiographical, of course, but the interest in psychology. And I don't think that's Cather. She's not writing these sort of adventure stories in a way that Hemingway often does, putting characters in Spanish Civil War, First World War, fighting bulls, running from that sort of thing. I mean this in people might think of this as a diminution of Cather, but I mean this as great praise, is that she's able to tell simple stories about simple people. And that's how I would describe her writing style. And you can think of exceptions to that in her writing. but that's really what it is. And so I think that's what makes her attractive, is that it's easy, even in stories that are taking place long ago, sometimes hundreds of years ago, in some cases, that she's able to create characters that are simple but very realistic and compelling, and the ability to take, as I say, tell a small story about relatively simple people and to make it compelling is, I think is what makes Cather a great American novelist.
I'd agree with that. Yeah.
Thank you. Look, and so thank you both so much. It's been wonderful listening and learning. Thanks to you. Thank you to the audience. This is for you and can't be done without you. So I will just repeat a few things. If you have further questions, which weren't answered or which come to you later, email me, and that's randall@nas.org. And I will be glad to convey your questions to the professors so they can have the option to answer. I will also say this is available in perpetuity on the NAS National Association of Scholars YouTube channel, and indeed so is all of our Great American Literature, and indeed our Great American History webinar series now concluded. So everything we do is up there, more or less. And I will also just give a shout out for our next one, which is on June 21st, 2 weeks from now. We'll be doing a webinar on Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, another great novel from a different part of the country. And that's, I think, all the stuff that needs to be said. Thank you all so much. It's been wonderful listening.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, John.
You bet. I've learned a lot.